was unexplored. The B-17 was one of their new models. Boeing, in 1935, had first released it at its model 299, but later called it the B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 had a tail gun in the back, with one person controlling it. A belly gunner and waist gunners. The belly gunner was also known as the ball turret, would have to sit like this and kind of lean back, controlling itself. The waist gunners, well, this is the Model G and had larger tails. So the waist gunners in earlier models didn't have the plexiglass and were standing kind of right next to each other and were kind of squished. But later on, they added the plexiglass and had them further apart in separate ways, so they wouldn't hit each other. But sometimes they didn't really particularly like the plexiglass, so would take it out. And the belly gunner usually was not in a very comfortable position for most of the time. You could turn all the way around, being able to shoot in any direction you want. The B-17 also, which was one of its greatest aspects, had 4 engines, which was new, and they didn't really accept it at first, thinking it wasn't safe, it was unexplored. But eventually in the war, they took the B-17 back, which the 4 engines were great in the war. If one of the engines broke down, they could still fly it decently with 3 engines. The pilot would sit in the top and have no gun control whatsoever. Behind the pilot was the navigator's gun and the navigator. The navigator would tell exactly where the pilot needed to go and fly. While in combat, they would get up out of their seat and go over to the gun. Now, they did not have any ladders to get into the B-17. They would have to hoist themselves up from here and pull themselves up. Kind of hard. And the B-17 had this one gun in the front that was controlled by the bombardier. The bombardier also had a navigator as well, which would tell him basically where to drop the bombs, and he had 2 guns on both sides. Down here is the bomb bay. This would open and close at the pilot's will, depending on when to open the bomb. Depending on when to drop the bombs. The B-17 could carry 8,000 pounds bomb. Basically. And through here, they would walk across from the cockpit to the waist gunners, or the navigator. Then they would walk up to the cockpit. There was no railing whatsoever, so they would basically risk walking across. This could get to the belly gunner, the waist gunner, and the tail gunner. Now, B-17 was a very high-powered bomber, but for the fighter aircraft, they would start with the steerman. The steerman was a biplane. Were proven technology because they were used in World War I and were safe, and they understood how they worked, so they would train the fighters in the biplane. The student would sit in the front, and the instructor would sit in the back. The student would have a long shirt on, and the instructor would pull on his shirt, telling him what to do and where to move. Since it was an open cockpit airplane, they couldn't communicate very well. Now, once they went from the steerman, they moved to the Texan, which was the next in line for training. The training in the Texan was more of a fighter stance. They had guns in the wings and could actually learn how to fire and control their plane as a fighter. two seats as well, and the instructor would sit in the back, and the student would sit in the front and control his shirt as well. It had a pretty simple cockpit, but not as simple as the Stearman. The Stearman had a very simple cockpit with about 5 or 6 gauges. The Texan had about the same, but was a little more complex. The Texan and the Stearman were both training for fighters. The L-19, which was also earlier than the Texan and the B-17, was also a two-man airplane and had simple gauges. This airplane would go out and do reconnaissance. It was a reconnaissance plane. It would basically search and look for anything it really was required to look for. The B-17 was a very big improvement. The B-17 was very efficient, 4 engines, belly gunner, waist gunner, front gunner, pilot, and he had his co-pilot, and they had a top gunner for the navigator. The Stearman, as well, was a trainer plane. The student would sit in the front and the instructor in the back would pull on his shirt. Once they went from the Stearman, they would go up to the Texan. And we had the L-19, which was a reconnaissance plane. All in all, aircraft in World War II was very, very important. Also, the B-29 dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which basically ended the war for us. So aircraft was very, very important in World War II, or we probably wouldn't have been able to win them.